What kind of sick freak spends 6 months putting a piece of music together just for the hell of it? Hi, I'm composer David Carovillano, and in the summer of 2019, I spent about a week writing a new cello concerto from the ashes. And 6 months later, on New Year's Eve, I put the finishing touches on the MIDI performance. Today, I'm going to walk you through the entire piece, from scoring it in Finale to exporting the final audio project in Cubase. So before we get started, if you like the music you hear today and you'd like to listen to some more of my stuff, I invite you to check out my websites, davidcarovillano.com and clarion.ca. The links will be in the description below. I won't ask you to click like or subscribe to my channel. I'm not looking to get famous on YouTube, and let's be honest, with the kind of music I write, I'm not gonna get famous. So with that, let's get started. All right, so looking at the project here, I've got it open in Finale, and the first thing you'll notice is the scoring. It's for piccolo, flute, oboe, clarinet in B flat, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, horns, 2 trumpets, trombones, and timpani, and then your solo cello line, and then your string section, violins 1, violins 2, violas, cello, and bass. All my projects start in Finale. I do write notation. I don't work directly in a DAW to compose unless I'm doing media music. Then I will write stuff right in Cubase if it doesn't need a score. But for anything that's intended for concerts or for live performance like this piece, I always write out a score in Finale first. So if you take a look here in the page view, we can see the score. I'll scroll through there a little. And one thing I should mention early on is I follow the MOLA standards. That's the Major Orchestra Librarians Association. They're basically a group of librarians for major orchestras in the US, and they've established a set of standards for the publication of scores to meet certain standards, like in terms of the font sizes and the page sizes and even the stock, the paper stock that they're printed on. It's all controlled by them to make the process uniform across the different orchestras. The musicians appreciate a well-formatted score to play off of, obviously, and there are challenges like page turns, like finding ways to avoid awkward page turns, making sure that there's ideally a bar of rest before you turn the page, things like that. So I do try to set up my scores that way. I use 18 by 12 paper, and I have a printer that can print on custom sizes, like large format printer. So when I'm ready to do my scores up for performance, that's ready to go. Okay, so starting with note entry. So when I start a new document like this, I'll zoom in to 100%, okay? And we'll scroll down and just look at the solo cello. So basically, as I write the piece, the first thing I do, I just start writing notes. I use my keyboard for note entry. When the piece is done, after it's done, I will go back and I'll put in some basic articulation. So you can see here I've got things like staccatos and accents, slurs, things like that. But generally speaking, there's not much else in my score at this stage. So if you look through this score right now, there's no dynamics. There's no tempo indications. For the most part, there might be 1 or 2 somewhere, but generally speaking, none of that stuff is in the score at this stage. I like to write fast. I get bored very quick and very easily. So when I'm working on a new piece, I literally start it with the intention of finishing it as quickly as possible. So a piece of this scale is a little larger form work. It's going to take time. A lot of my chamber pieces that are in the 5 to 6 minute range will often take about 2 days, maybe 3 days to write. A few could be a little longer or a little shorter. A piece like this, surprisingly, I gave myself about a month to write it. I was lucky enough to finish it in about 8 days, but I did work, good 6-hour days each day writing. And anyone who composes or does creative stuff knows that to write nonstop for 6 hours is pretty mind-numbing and challenging. So normally my workday will be 2 to 3 hours of writing. But on this piece, I guess I was motivated and ideas were flowing fairly easily. So I got it done with about 6 hours a day in about 8 days for the 4 movements. Of course, as we get into the MIDI production, you'll see that this is the quick part. Writing the notes is very quick. Getting the MIDI production done is an insanely long process. And then going back and making the score ready for printing and publication is also a kind of tedious process there. So a lot more time goes into it, but the initial composition took about 8 days. So when the piece is finished in Finale, I will export PDFs of all the parts and the score. So the first thing I would do in this case is I would go to extract parts. So if I click on extract parts here, you'll see all the instruments show up. Okay, and I will include the score in that, and then I will click the open extracted part button at the bottom and generate files from, and then I have my file name there, from the Ashes with the little percentage sign that puts the automatic page numeration. So then I'll click OK, and it will literally extract each part from the main score. It's going to say if I want to overwrite parts because I've already done this. As you can see, the parts are going to show up here. So right off the bat, we have the timpani part. Maybe let's go find, okay, well, there's the double bass. I'm just closing them down and going to find the solo cello part. Close that down. Okay, so here's the solo cello part, because it is, after all, a cello concerto. And you can see basically Finale has turned it into a file with just the cello part. And what I'll do from there is I will export a PDF. I'll go to Export PDF of the piece and save it in a given folder. And once I have all my parts extracted, so I'll click no on this. I won't go through all of them right now because it'll take a while. So once I've extracted all my parts, I'll also export a MIDI file of the entire work. And so I'll go to the export MIDI command, and I'll export that. And I will make sure to save it in format 1, all instruments saved to separate tracks. I save my bookmarks as markers, and that's it. And then I would click OK. I'm not going to do it now. But that would save a MIDI file, and that's what I'll use to bring into Cubase, where I'm going to do the MIDI production. Okay, so we're inside Cubase right now, and the first thing I wanted to do was show you my orchestral template. I use predominantly Vienna instruments, so VSL, Vienna Symphonic Library, and I think for the kind of music I do, which is mostly classical, chamber, and orchestral music, I think that they're just the undisputed champions of that. Their instruments work so well for me, and I love their stuff, so they're pretty much 95% of my template. If you go through here, you can see pretty much every piece I work on, I use a full template. I load everything up. I don't bother. I used to have like little smaller custom templates for smaller ensembles or different projects, and I had my separate ones for when I did media music. But for my classical stuff, pretty much everything starts with the full template. And you can see here I have my orchestra violins, and then I have my dimension violins, violins to orchestra, dimension to violins to dimension. So I basically have orchestral violins, violas, cello, and bass, and then I have the dimension version of them from Vienna. So those libraries are up there. Then we move on. I have my solo strings. So I have violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, and bass solo, also VSL. Then I have VSL's chamber strings, the violins 1 and 2, violas, cellos, and basses. Then I have some orchestra muted violins, section orchestra strings. So I've got a couple of like the instruments. Some of them will have like a complete string section in one patch, so to speak. So if you're sketching something out quickly, that can be useful. I don't really use them because, like I said, I do most of my work with a notation program first. So I'm not really sketching ideas out in my DAW in Cubase, but some people work that way. Appassionata strings. And then I have a few things like the Joshua Bell violin. That is phenomenal. Love that from Embertone. Check that out if you haven't seen it. It's an amazing solo violin. Then I have the Synchron strings. And then going into that, we have a library I got way back when I started out about 5 years ago. 8Do's Adagietto, I believe it's called. I haven't really used them in years. They're part of the template. They're there. And then I have all of the VSL brass. So I have my trumpets and Dimension and the original libraries from VSL. And then same thing I have after you go through the brass. I have my woodwinds. And I know I'm scrolling pretty quickly here. And I'm talking a lot, so feel free to skip ahead or stop and freeze something you want to look at a little more closely. But I'm going to move through here as best I can. And then I've got contact stuff also from when I first started out. I got the, what was it, Complete? I think Complete 5 is what it was called. That was my very first library. And yeah, got me started. So it's got some cool things, ethnic flutes and bagpipes and reeds and things like that. And then back to some more VSL and then a Piano Tech Steinway. So I use their piano in a lot of stuff. The contact piano, the giant piano, which is pretty popular in that media and film music. And then a few other little miscellaneous libraries and then percussion all the way down. So you can see basically my template is 90% VSL, 90-95% VSL, and about 98% of what I'm using. Like very rarely will I touch anything that's not VSL in this template. But if I was writing something where I didn't have a VSL instrument for it, then I probably would. So that's my basic template there. Okay, so back in the main Cubase project window, you can see basically what I'll do when I first open up Cubase. I will import the MIDI file I created in Finale. I will go and import that MIDI file into Cubase, and all the resulting tracks will be set down here as MIDI tracks. And then I will just drag each individual MIDI track onto the appropriate instruments line. So for instance, in this piece being a cello concerto, I put the cello solo at the top so I could see it easily alongside all the strings. And you can see I have my sections color coded. So the brass are blue and the winds are orange, and then the percussion is purple. And this just has a timpani, this piece, so there's not a lot of percussion. Normally there will be a lot more tracks there. So basically I import the MIDI, and then what I do after that is I go in, and this is really time consuming. So I'll open the cello solo part, and if you take a look here for the whole track, now this is a 26-minute piece, so let's be honest, there's a lot of data. Let me get this cursor out of the way here. There is a lot of data to be done in this. If you take a look at the cello part for the whole piece, it's pretty intense. But the first thing I'll do is Finale will import some MIDI data that I don't want to keep in the piece. So before I've done anything, so what you're seeing here is the finished product, but I'll go in and I'll remove some MIDI data that comes in from Finale. Some of those include program changes, system exclusive messages. I'll remove things like the panning. I'll remove main volume. I will literally strip the MIDI file down to just the notes from Finale, nothing else. There's no information, just the notes and the imported velocities that come with the finale file, because my intention is to basically take those notes and painstakingly one by one go through and make a performance out of it. So once I've removed all the MIDI data and all the lanes from the finale file, then I literally will start to create a performance. And basically what you can see here is the first step to that is key switches. So I will go in for every instrument. So here's the solo cello, and I will go in and I will enter in key switches. I'm going to drag over, if I can here, the Vienna instrument player, which is on a different screen, just to show you kind of my key switch setup. So taking the solo cello, okay, it's set up like this, and this is credit to my wife, my beautiful wife, Rebecca, who is also a musician. She's a clarinetist, and shout out to our duo, Aclarion. You can check us out at aclarion.ca, ACCLARION.ca. And so we're an accordion and clarinet duo. That's what we do as performers. But in the world of composition, she acts in a lot of ways as my mixing and mastering person for a lot of my music. When I finish writing it and doing the MIDI production, she comes in and tweaks it and makes it sound better than I could on my own. So shout out to her. She came up with this key switch system based on kind of the way I work. And after observing the way I do things, she came up with a logical way to get all of Vienna's articulations into a system that works for me. So I use a little Alesis 2-octave keyboard for my key switches so that I can keep the entire 88-note main piano controller free for notes. It also lets me keep the cellos and basses and low instruments like the bassoons and trombones that normally they'll split the key switches up like into the C5 octave for those. So you'll have like the key switches for violins will be on the low end of the piano, and the key switches for instruments like bassoons will be on the high end of the piano. So I wanted to kind of memorize one system for all my instruments, and the only way to really do that was to make sure that my key switches were literally off the piano keyboard, the 88-note keyboard, because some of the lower instruments like the double basses can go to a low C, and that would interfere with key switches. So we got a separate keyboard, the Alesis keyboard for key switches, and we set them all up here. In the lower octave here, we have all the different articulations, detached, staccato, performance intervals, and then from there, in the second octave, you get a further breakout. So if I click, for instance, detached, staccato, I'll pick C on my Alesis keyboard, the lowest C, and then that'll select staccato. Then the second octave, I will pick which type of staccato it is, whether it's detached long, detached short, staccato, or spiccato. So basically, I need 2 key switches for every single note. So if you go here to the performance intervals, I'll pick C sharp, the low C sharp on my keyboard, and then the second octave C will let me pick the type of articulation in that octave. So I basically have to put in 2 articulations for each, or 2 key switches for every articulation. So how does that look here in the actual file? You can see the low octave, C minus 2, is basically picking detached, and then this is like a sforzando or forte piano, and then detached and forte piano and legato over here. But the top key switch is the specific individual articulation in that category that I want. So I might go between a performance legato and then an espressivo legato, and then I might have a marcato legato. So there's all these different key switches that Vienna, or articulations that Vienna offers, and we found a way to get them all organized within this 2-octave range. And if you look through the entire piece, another thing people always wonder is just how many key switches do you need? Well, take a look here. There is no shortcut. If you want a convincing performance, take a look at just how many key switches I enter. So you're looking at the bottom part of the screen here for the key switches. And this is just one instrument, so I've got to do this for the entire orchestra. It's a daunting task, and I'm not going to lie to you. It takes a boatload of time to do this. So this piece here took me about just under 6 months. I was working on other projects throughout, of course. Like, I don't just have this one piece, but if I were to estimate, I mean, I can't put an hour figure to it, but it's in the thousands, 1,000 hours plus, could be more, over the course of 6 months that I put into this piece, just getting the MIDI production up. So as you can see here, I don't want to bore you to death, but that's all the key switching. So for larger orchestral works like this, typically the MIDI notes that I've imported from Finale are what I go with for the project, and the main thing I tweak is the individual velocities of every single note. So again, if you look here at the solo cello part, you can see that every single note is carefully chosen. This isn't just randomly. I'm not drawing across lines to sculpt a phrase. I'm literally going back, I'm listening, and I'm entering them individually. So this is kind of counterintuitive to the way I am as a musician. I really am instinctual with what I do. Like, I mean, I'm formally trained. Obviously, I have an academic background in music. But as a performer, I really try to feel music and not overly analyze and think it. So once I work in this realm, I feel like I'm becoming a completely different person, and I've kind of grown fixated with the ability to be super precise with these kind of performances. In a live performance, when I'm playing my instrument, I'm literally, it's a one-shot deal. You're out on stage, you're performing a concert. Rebecca and I are performing a concert. We're doing a lot of practice in advance of the concert, but once we get out there, we know exactly what we're going to do, and we let our instinct and years of experience and communication together as an ensemble take over. Once I sit here doing this kind of work, I feel like the ability to be able to revise things and to go back and make things better on every subsequent listen kind of becomes a little bit of you become a little OCD, and I find myself spending inordinate amounts of time tweaking MIDI data. So you can see here as I scroll through, every note, there's attention paid to it. And I think that essentially is what allows for, I don't want to toot my own horn because I'm sure someone's going to jump into the comments and say it's not very realistic compared to a real orchestra, but I'd like to think that these performances I'm doing are fairly convincing, at least in the world of MIDI. I'd like to think that. I'm sure someone will tell me, oh no, your music is not very convincing, but basically for me and for where I'm at, I think I'm putting a lot of effort in to get a performance that, if it's the only performance I ever get of the piece, as in if I never get a live orchestral recording of this piece, I will be satisfied with the end result enough to know that I conveyed what I wanted to convey in the music through this MIDI performance. And to do that, you have to spend the time. Like I said, almost 6 months of work went into doing the MIDI for this piece. So I should mention that for my smaller works, for chamber music, when I'm writing for a small ensemble, say a string quartet or a piano trio, or even just a simple clarinet and piano piece, I will take advantage of my piano skills. I'm not a pianist. I don't consider myself a professional pianist by any stretch, but I'm fairly proficient at playing piano, so I will play in parts. And even in this cello concerto, there were a lot of parts, solo lines or important lyrical phrases. I may go back after I've got all the MIDI notes and I may play them in myself. I'll put a click track on, a metronome beat on, and I'll play the part in. And then I may or may not even quantize it after the fact, depending how tight it is with the other orchestral parts. I mean, at the end of the day, the idea is when you're playing things in, you're trying to create the authentic live performance. The rubato, the ebb and flow of a performance is not quantized and literal down to 1/1000th of a second on the beat. The problem is with MIDI, if you start getting a little bit loose with your performance and then you line it up against 20 other parts, if each part was played in and they were all not quantized, you would have an absolute mess on your hands. So what I think also contributes to the authentic sounding performance, I may quantize the notes afterwards to be directly on the beat, or iterative quantize them to be close to the beat. But what really helps, if you take a look here, is the tempo track. So I'll open that up and take a look at this. Sometimes, you know, when I'm looking at the kind of work that goes into creating a performance via MIDI, I sometimes do wish it could be a little more easy, a little less time consuming, a little less insane. Like, take a look at this tempo track. And this is the kind of work that I don't enjoy particularly. I'm not going to lie. Doing a tempo track after I've got all my MIDI notes in and I've got my velocities and I've got my CC data in and I've got all that stuff done, I'll go back and I'll do my tempo track. And then after I do the tempo track, oftentimes I have to go back and change some more of the notes to reflect the new choices I've made. Because, for instance, I might have a pause in the tempo track, like a slowdown here, and say I had a dynamic swell, a crescendo patch at that moment, and I set it to crescendo 2 seconds. And say my pause is more like 4 seconds, so now I might have to go back and change that to a crescendo 4-second patch. So sometimes there's things like that that you tweak. But overall, between a quantized part, so all the notes pretty quantized on the beat, combined with velocities that are individually selected for every single note, and expression data like CC data down here, and a tempo track that's really detailed, you will create a much more fluid and realistic performance that will, simulate what you're looking for. Okay, so after all the MIDI is done, I'll go in there and I will open up the Cubase mixer and I will adjust levels, just tweaking little things. So like you'll see here, the dimension strings, the violins 1, violins 2, violas, cellos, and basses, all are at different levels. I use Mir Pro as my reverb, and I'll get to that in a second. But generally speaking, I will adjust levels relative to their natural volume. So like if you open up a project and you use Mir Pro, there's a cool feature where you can select the natural volumes, and I'll show you that screen in a minute. Let me see if I can just do it right now. Let me do that. So if we go in here, there's a set natural volume button right here. So for the cello, for instance, set natural volume, and it'll bump the sound level down to where they feel all the instruments of the orchestra balance well with each other. And that's a great starting point, especially if you're not familiar with orchestration and you don't know what an instrument produces. The surefire, in terms of volume, the surefire way to tell you're working with MIDI is when someone puts a piece together for orchestra and say has the oboe cutting through the entire orchestra at 50 decibels louder than every other instrument combined. If the balance is off and there's not a realistic sound level for each of the sections of the orchestra, and there's not a homogeneity to the sound, like if the blend is off, that'll alert our ears pretty quickly. So setting the natural volume for all the instruments and getting a sense of what they actually sound like in an orchestral hall, properly mixed, is a great way to start. That said, I will bump levels up or down accordingly, but I try to do it all relative. So for instance, I may select all the strings, and starting from their natural volumes, I'll bump them up or down as a group. I try not to do too much individual changes that would affect the balance with the other section strings. So for instance, I won't just take volume 6 up for violins 1 and then drop violins 2 down here because they're too loud. Instead, if I find the balance is so off, I'll look at my composition, I'll look at what I've got in the MIDI data. So if the violin 2 section is way too loud, for instance, I'll look and see, did I have my expression too loud or too high or too low? And I'll make adjustments in the MIDI data or my velocities and things like that. Once I'm fairly confident that all the instruments are where I want them, this mixing that we've been looking at here is just for a slight tweak to bolster the sounds up or down so that there's no clipping. Okay? It's not really to adjust or fix mistakes within the writing itself. Like if you've written a thing, fortissimo for violins 1 and 2, and it's not loud enough for your taste because the other instruments are overpowering it, you might want to look at the density of your orchestral scoring and see, like, do you have like every other section blasting out fortissimo at the same time, hiding the line you want to be heard in the violins 1 and violins 2. You might want to look at the writing, not just saying, okay, I'm going to crank up the violins in the mixer and then lower everything else, because that's not necessarily a realistic way to do things. So that's taking a look at the mixer, and in a second we will move on to Mir. Okay, so I've got Mir Pro opened here, and you can see that I did this cello concerto in the Vienna Concert House, the Grosser Saal stage, and I've got all the instruments positioned on stage here. So you've got your solo cello up front, and then you've got your 5 string sections, violins 1, violins 2, violas, cellos, and basses. And depending on a piece, sometimes I'll have my violins 1 and 2 on opposite ends of the microphone. Other times I'll have them side by side, like here. So there's different recording techniques, and there's different setups in a real orchestra. There's different ways that the sections will set up. There's not like one size fits all. There are standard positions, like this is a pretty standard setup, but there are occasionally reasons you might want to split your violins across the stage instead of having them all on one side. Also, the other thing to remember is when you do these kind of MIDI recordings and the way people listen, if you hard pan things, like if I have all my violins coming off the left side and I'm listening through headphones and all I hear are violins coming through my left ear and say basses and cellos coming through my right ear, that's not really indicative of how we would hear in real life or in a natural setting in the concert hall. The sounds will be, the instruments might be positioned on the left, but the way you receive that sound in your ears, you're going to get it in both ears. There's going to be reflections off of all the walls, and you're going to correct for the things you're seeing, and your ears are going to receive the violins through both ears. I'm not at all an engineer to tell you the science behind it, but I know for a fact that we don't isolate the violins out of the left ear and the basses out of the right ear, for instance. But when you're listening through headphones, that can happen. If you hard pan the violins left and hard pan the basses right, that would happen. So I always try to have a little bit of a spread, and you can see with Mir Pro, you can adjust how wide the spread of the signal is graphically on the screen. So I can make the violin section spread out to be heard through both ears, so to speak, or through both the right and left speaker. And you can adjust that for all the different instruments. So right off the bat, you can see we've got all the instruments positioned on stage, and then I have my mic settings here. So I've got 2 mics. The first mic is the 888 spaced variation 1, and then the second mic is the stereo 115 degree cardioids, and that's put in the gallery. So the second mic, if I zoom out here, you can see is at the back of the hall. Okay, and the first mic is at the conductor's position. I like the ability with the close mic position to capture a lot of detail in the sound. You get more of the sound, for instance, like the cello, the strings in the third movement when it's cello solo. You can hear the natural noises of that close proximity of the mic. You can hear the natural string sounds and the finger plucking. You can hear all of those raw sounds much better. The secondary mic gives you a little more of the ambiance of the room. It gives you a little more of the room sound, and then you can dial it in. I've offset my dry-wet ratio to -30, and the reverb time has been left at the full length for this haul, but oftentimes I'll even adjust that down a little. I find that the beauty of Mirror Pro is you can get real-time feedback. You can make these changes graphically in the interface, wait a few seconds for it to process, and then go and press play and listen to the differences and arrive at the ideal sound for you. You can also just swap out the stage. So like I could go in and pick a different studio. I only have the first 2 room packs for Mirror. I have the concert house and I have their Teldex studio, which is an incredible space. The Teldex I use probably 70% of the time for a lot of my stuff, but for this piece I chose to use the concert house. So after finishing the mix in Cubase, I will then do the final mixing and mastering. We use Ozone for that, and like I said, my wife Rebecca mostly does the mastering. It's good to have a second set of ears and someone who she's very sensitive to sound and really good at picking out things that might stick out that I haven't noticed. You'll probably guess after spending 6 months working on a piece, you lose a little objectivity. So by the end of the process, it's really nice that she's there to listen and kind of add her feedback. And she may spend upwards of another week herself tweaking things, making changes. And then I come in and listen with her and we kind of agree upon, the final settings. And we export the piece and that's done. The recording as you hear it is done. And then the last thing to do, and this is horrible. So after all that's done, we go back to finale, and now we have to finish the score. I have to put in all the things that I did in the Cubase project in terms of the tempo choices and the articulations. I have to go back and I have to put all of that into the score. And I try to make the final score match my audio performance as close as possible. Not because the way I'm interpreting my piece is the only way it can be done. But because if I send the score and the audio file to a conductor, for instance, I want them to be able to kind of just get a sense of what I was thinking as a composer and be able to match what they're hearing to what they're seeing in the score within reason. There's always going to be subtle differences between the two. And then at least at that point, they have the composer's kind of interpretation, what I was looking for, or how I heard my piece. And then, of course, they're free to bring their own artistry and interpretation to the thing and make the piece their own. That's the collaboration, the collaborative experience between a composer and performers is, the composer gives you ideas of what they want, but it's not a thou shalt play my music my way. If I want to hear the music exactly my way, that's what the MIDI performance is for. The computer does what I tell it to do. So when I have the finished performance with MIDI, that's basically my way of saying my ideal performance is here, and now I want to hear someone else's. So half of the goal of writing this music and then finishing off the scores the way I do and putting that time into it is to give a performer or an orchestra or a chamber ensemble or even a single solo musician, give them everything that I can to make it as easy as possible for them to just jump in and learn the piece and perform the piece and hopefully show me a different take on my piece. There's nothing more rewarding when you're done a piece than to hear someone else interpret your music. And that's what I live for, and that's essentially why I do what I do. Anyways, I've talked up a storm here today. I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough, and Again, check out my website, davidcarovillano.com or aclarion.ca if you want to hear Rebecca and me doing our accordion and clarinet thing. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll check me out again next time.